So I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's program, Backpack Ambassadors, how youth integrated travel in Europe. My name is George Sigayev. I am the Visitor Services and Public Programs Coordinator at the History Center of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, and we're very excited for you all to be joining us tonight. I'm going to go through a couple of Zoom technicalities prior to the start of our program, just to make it the most pleasurable viewing experience. If you go to the top right section of your screen, there's a selection that you can pick speaker view and full screen. I'd recommend pressing both of those just to make this presentation the most pleasurable for your viewing experience. I'd also like to say that we recommend everybody keep their microphones muted for the duration of the presentation, just to not interrupt our guest speaker while he's speaking. Additionally, I ask that you please keep all vocal questions until the end of the presentation. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end dedicated to questions and answers. And so if you think of a question, you can either write it down or you can send it via the chat function on the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring that as the presentation goes on. And then at the very end, we can go through those. And another reminder is that this program will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel following its completion. And that's just youtube.com, History Center of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff. And you can find all of our previous programs that were recorded on there as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our Executive Director, Carol Summerfield.
Well, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Rick Jobs for being part of this from Pacific University. And Rick has helped us build the exhibit that is currently in the museum and is a scholar in the history of travel, and along with other things. And we're going to be talking tonight about his book, Backpack Ambassadors, which, as you can tell, was used heavily to influence the exhibit and help frame this conversation. All right, so welcome and thank you for being part of this. So this book covers several decades of travel and specifically focused on the ramifications of a top-down versus bottom-up form of travel, where either governments solicited travel and really looked at what the impact was going to be, or it was really culturally driven. And throughout these decades, there have been shifts, particularly in the focus of youth travel. So in order to just sort of frame the general thought around the rest of the evening's conversation, what are the effects when a government does embrace travel and when it sort of pushes it away? What are some of the things that we've seen over the decades?
Okay, so I guess the first thing that I'll say is that so what we think of as backpacking in Europe and that sort of travel is pretty new to the post-war period. And so governments were pretty interested initially after the Second World War in encouraging that sort of travel. And so they start adopting policies to encourage youth exchange, study abroad, all kinds of stuff. And so they're initiating policies, but at the same time, there's a push from young people themselves, right? Who are wanting to travel. They feel cooped up. They're wanting to get out and explore. And so you have this sort of push-pull factor of government sort of embracing something that's sort of more grassroots and individualistic and independent and trying to support that. But then that sometimes means that the young people doing travel doesn't always do it in a way that the state really appreciates. So you have both, you know, this government encouragement, particularly hostels, rail passes, and I can talk about all that sort of stuff. And then on the other hand, when young people congregate in too great of a number in a particular spot, then they could sometimes become a problem.
And so the other part of it, which is really interesting, is you start to move out of World War II, and you get, again, one of the things that we talk about within the exhibit is this idea that you had sort of a luxury aspect to travel, particularly in Europe, through up until the sort of First World War. And then there is sort of a weird period that's interwar with the rise of Germany, some of the other stuff that's taking place. But really after World War II, it is a massive rebuilding effort that the infrastructure for luxury travel is gone. in much of the countries, and that youth travel not only becomes part of a way to pull revenue in, but it's a way to rebuild. It's actually physically a way to rebuild. And can you talk a little about some of the efforts that some of the countries made toward using youth to this end?
Absolutely. So big picture, after the Second World War is when we truly see a democratization of travel more generally, not just of young people. So in the interwar period in Europe, you start to see guaranteed work weeks, paid vacation for the working class. That all sort of gets implemented in the late 1930s. But then, of course, we end up with 6 years of really bad war. But after the war, economic boom, people have more spending money. You start to see what we would think of as, mass tourism. And so the young people, and I have a couple of images here. So one thing that they did is they wanted to encourage young people to travel. And so they set up all these different sort of service camps in which young people would spend a month or 2 months, what have you, sort of at a not exactly like a summer camp, a lakeside summer camp, but at a site where they would help rebuild parks, hostels, all kinds of things like that. So part of the program, and this is immediately after the war, in the second half of the 1940s into the 1950s, UNESCO set up a central clearinghouse, and this wasn't always necessarily governmental. It was sort of private groups and different groups. And so UNESCO sort of operated as sort of an umbrella organization to help coordinate this. And so young people were sort of going around helping literally to rebuild and reconstruct the continent after the war, and often in ways that were meant to enhance the travel infrastructure. Most famously, perhaps, in terms of this, are what are known as the youth railways in Yugoslavia in 46, 47, and 48. And Yugoslavia was building railways, and they recruited young people from all over Europe to come, and tens of thousands of them did. And they worked, for the summer, helping to rebuild these railways. So they were building rail lines and hostels and other sorts of parks and sort of contributing to the rebuilding effort in ways that were meant to augment the sort of travel infrastructure that had been damaged from the war.
I have to say that the Yugoslavia story I did not know, and a surprising number of young adults moved through that program. It was like Yugoslavia's, civilian corps. It was like a CCC or WPA for Yugoslavia. I mean, It was amazing, the sort of momentum that they were able to get behind that program.
Right, and then they would. So one of the people I mentioned in there, there's a super very important big deal historian. His name is E.P. Thompson. Sort of one of the most important historians in terms of the field of social history. But when he was a young man, he went and did this, and his very first book was essays about this experience in Yugoslavia. And so they had sort of these international brigades sort of things that young people would sort of work and labor for a week or 2 weeks or a month with their compatriots, but also with all the other young people there. And then after that, they would travel through Yugoslavia. They would tour Yugoslavia. They would sometimes then tour Italy. So it itself became a stimulus for them to begin traveling. Yeah.
That was one of the other things I found really interesting in looking at the book, was the variation from country to country in terms of just the interest in travel, the acceptance of travel. Your description of the Italian response to both domestic and international travel was amazing to me, where they're just like, oh, why would I leave home? Mom's be here.
That's right. Mom's cooking. How can I go away? So, right. So it is true, right? So sort of young traveling and rambling really begins as a practice in Northern and Northwestern Europe, and eventually expands to Southern Europe and into Eastern Europe. In particular, Germany, for example, in the early 20th century, had this thing called the Wandervogel, which are these sort of hiking rambling sort of clubs that were particularly for young people. This predates scouting. It wasn't organized quite like scouting in that way. And in fact, hosteling begins in Germany out of this. So the first youth hostel set up in Germany in 1913 in the Rhineland, and it's meant to be, you know, a shelter, basically for hiking in the hills and that sort of thing. And so hosteling starts in Germany, and it really grows in the 1920s, and it starts expanding to other countries. And initially, hosteling is just about going out for hiking, and it's more countryside, and it's getting to know your own country sort of thing. And it expands throughout Northern Europe, but not into Italy. And so, for example, in the Italian case, after the International Hostel Federation really wants hostels in Italy because young people are traveling to Italy, but there's no hostel infrastructure. And the Italians are like, nah. And so they take a long time to get hosteling set up in Italy because the Italians themselves aren't necessarily that interested in it. In Italy, sort of what we think of as a youth peer group, like young people as a peer group or youth as a social body, develops much later. In fact, develops sort of in the post-war period, whereas in other places in the UK, in Germany, in the United States, we really see that forming, you know, 30, 40, 50 years earlier than we do in Italy. Where
even Spain was a little behind the curve, you know,
oh, yeah.
Not as much as Italy, but still it was the same thing with the Spanish families, was that the
Yep.
kids didn't really venture out.
That's right. It also has to do with politics, right? So Spain, as a result of the Spanish Civil War in the 30s, this is when Francisco Franco becomes, you know, a dictator. So Spain is not a democracy. Spain is fairly closed to the rest of Europe. Stays out of the Second World War, so he was wise there, Franco. But then in the late 1950s, Spain realizes that, you know, they need to get some, they need to build relationships with Europe, in part to get some of that economic boom that's happening in Europe into Spain. And so one of the first things they do is they create hostels in the late 1950s. But again, it's slow to get Spanish youth themselves to start using them because there wasn't a habit or a practice of that sort of youth peer group independence away from the family and the local village. So that was very similar to Italy as well. So that has to develop, and it has to be, you know, we think about these things as being natural, right? But they're not. They're historical. And so, you know, even what we think of as youth and young people, while on the one hand it is a biological developmental category, but what it means, what one does, you know, all of that is historically determined.
Right. Well, the expectations of what the behavior is of that particular age group. Now, the other thing that I actually knew nothing about, which really surprised me, was the limitations on German travel after the war, that they could only travel, and if I remember it correctly, with $5, not a day, total.
Well, right. So after the war, Germany is occupied by the four Allied powers, by the United States, the UK, the Soviet Union, and France. And so Germany does not have its own government until 1949, 1950, West Germany. And initially the goal wasn't to divide Germany into West and East. That just is a consequence of sort of what happens. But Germany's an occupied country. And so even traveling within Germany between zones is hard, right? Because of border controls, and Germany's flattened. I mean, just like,
right, decimated.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a mess. And so there were all kinds of restrictions and controls, particularly related to currency, movement. And then there's the issue of, you know, Germany had conquered and occupied most of Europe. There's the issue of how the rest of Europe was going to respond to Germans moving about out of occupied Germany. So they had lots of restrictions, yeah.
And so you end up with the peace builders, the Servas movement, right? Which is this idea of welcoming German youth into your home abroad so that they can in fact travel on the restrictions that they have, which I found really interesting, and also sort of begins the structure of pensions, right? The idea of pensions, which are, I go and I stay in someone's home. It's sort of the early version of Airbnb, except you usually were greeted in a train station by somebody. And I was really surprised by that comes out of, is it Norway, the peace builders?
Well, so he's American actually, but he encounters, he's in Sweden,
Okay.
and encounters a German working at a work site, one of these sort of summer work camps, right? That were intentionally international to try to bring young people from different countries together to work on a common project. And so he finds this out, and so then he starts hitchhiking around Europe trying to find host homes. And basically, I mean, so this is all pre-internet, of course, very, very pre-internet. So he basically is trying to create a list of hosts for young people, not just Germans, but for young people to be able to stay cheaply, because the hostel network had not yet rebounded and been rebuilt. And so you get, Servas, peace builders, and other groups sort of couch surfing, right? Like, where's an address in a home that, they'll let me stay, for a night or two while I'm passing through. Yeah.
Well, and one of the things that you write about is that the German students sort of expected this to be the penance tour, right? That they could go and they could stay, but that they were going to be held accountable for the actions of Germany. And they weren't really. It was sort of seen as that was the older generation. You're a new generation, and we're going to take you on your face value.
Yes, I mean, not always, but yes. And some of the Germans, actually, some of the young Germans, particularly there's this guy, Bernhard Vesper, who wrote a book called Die Reise, which is the trip. And he's traveling around in the 1960s. He, for example, he wanted the penance. His father was a Nazi, and he intentionally in his travels, he intentionally visits sites of Nazi massacres. Because he wants to atone in a way. And so, but he is surprised by the fact that while he's actually seeking that out, that in fact people are like, well, you didn't do that, it wasn't you. And so he sort of is surprised by this and starts to understand and starts to identify then, and this is sort of one of the important things about the book, the ways in which young people, while they don't relinquish their sense of national identity, they begin to start to see themselves as associated with each other based on their age, right? That they share something in common by being young and being European, even if they're also Norwegian and German. Right.
Well, and that's actually, so it's a really interesting component to it, which is the idea of transnationalism, right? That this starts to begin at this point, that there's sort of a fomenting of democracy, democratic voice, and being responsible for more than just my own country. East Germany and the Eastern Bloc react really interestingly to this, right? So in the 1950s, all of a sudden, this volume of sort of travelers is not exactly welcomed anymore within the Eastern Bloc.
Yeah, so the Eastern Bloc. So first, I should say that the initial hardening of the border that becomes the so-called Iron Curtain was from the Western Allies, the Americans. They were the first ones that actually sort of closed the border. But in terms of hardening the border, so Berlin sits in the Soviet zone of East Germany, of occupied Germany. And Berlin itself is divided in, between the four powers. So that's how we end up with West Berlin inside East Germany. And so what happens is, over the course of the 1950s, young East Germans are basically, they can't easily cross the border between East Germany to West Germany, but they can easily get into West Berlin. And so there's this phenomena over the course of the 1950s called Republikflucht, that is leaving the East Germany, leaving away from it. And so this is why the Berlin Wall is built, to contain, it's to prevent young East Germans from leaving East Germany and finding refuge and asylum in West Berlin. And so it's all about controlling the mobility of the young. That's what the Berlin Wall is for, is to try to curtail that Republikflucht. Because it's like 2 million over the course of the 1950s, like 2 million young East Germans leave. Yeah.
One of the things that you touch on is the developing sense of sort of political voice in some of the young people who are traveling. And you've got in the 1960s, right, the rise of the beatniks, the rise of the vagabonds, the free love, but also political participation. They're participating in marches, they're participating in protests.
Right. So 1968 is this big deal year in Europe. It is in the United States too. 1968 is when the Democratic Convention was in Chicago, of course.
You know it well.
And the you know the protests and the police really went after them.
Yeah.
So earlier in 68, you had seen similar things in Paris in particular, and in Prague and elsewhere too. In Berlin. So 1968, what ends up happening is so by this point, young people in Europe are accustomed to traveling. I mean, they're traveling a lot. There's like lots of studies done in the 1960s. Like the majority of young people by the time they're 20 have already visited 2 or 3 countries. This is an absolutely new phenomenon. So when you're in your early 20s in 1968, you're already an experienced traveler. So you don't have that sort of mental impediment, like, you know, to keep you from going to another country. So when these protests start to break out, young people from different countries, you know, congregate there and flock to them. And as one sort of shuts down, then another one, another country opens up, they scramble over there. So so countries begin to, so the governments who had been encouraging young people to travel and who had reduced visa restrictions according to age, they had really opened their borders to young people more than others, they begin to shut them down. And more than that, they begin to talk badly about them, right? They become xenophobic, like, oh, these are all foreigners, these are all, you know, troublemakers. And the young people respond, and I'll show you a couple. The young people respond with a few different, so these are posters I'll show you from
Oh yeah.
So this one is this is fuck all frontiers. Okay. This one is you know, frontiers equals repression. Frontiers are borders. That means borders.
Yeah.
And then one person in particular, it's not really the leader, but the media chose him as the leader, was Daniel Cohn-Bendit, this guy right here. Mm-hmm. And he was Jewish, and he was French and German. And so he was described in the press in France, even though he grew up in France, he was born in France, but he had German citizenship. And so he was described in France as, you know, he was denigrated as being Jewish and being German. And so the young people began chanting, "We are all Jews, we are all Germans." And he was also described, here's another one, "We are all undesirable."
It was surprising because he and then Tariq Ali,
yep,
you know, the way they're denigrated by the press and by the politicians and the leaders is so just xenophobic and racist or
yep,
bigoted.
Yes.
Overtly. Like, it was shocking to me after World War II that you would have France basically going, it's a German Jew, to a kid who grew up in France.
Yeah.
They tried to ban him. And one of his great prides was that he kept showing up at French rallies like, borders aren't keeping me.
That's right. So one of the big things about 1968 is this transnationality, right? That the young themselves did not feel contained by the nation, and neither in their politics, nor in their sense of identity, nor in their movement and mobility. And so what you see happen in 1968, and the way the press and the governments respond is they respond in the way in which they have been responding to immigration. So you have two, in the 1960s and early 1970s, you have two major sort of transnational mobile networks happening: young people traveling and immigration.
Yeah.
Guest workers.
A worker force, yeah.
And so And so one had been celebrated by the state, hurrah, young people, and the other had been denigrated. And so, but then when the young people start to sort of act on the politics that have come out of this travel and this mobility, then they become to be denigrated as the immigrants had been. So they sort of transfer that same sort of tone and vocabulary from denigrating immigrants and the working class onto the young people themselves.
Right, almost everybody, it almost becomes universal. All right, so I'm going to read a quote from your book because this struck me as sort of prophetic of the ideology that forms the foundation of the EU, right? So this is on page 132. The ease and frequency with which middle-class young people in the 1960s traveled to cities such as Amsterdam, Berlin, London, Paris, and Prague created interpersonal solidarities that were crucial to the formation of movements that challenged national demarcations of power. More than mobilization, travel became the foundation for a youth identity that emphasized mobility and built a shared political culture across national boundaries. These qualities contested the frontiers of the dominant state powers, which were used to contain, segregate, and frequently close access for groups across society. In this sense, through physical and ideological movements, young people in the late 1960s sought to create their own kind of interconnected European identity and community. And I was thinking about that. So if I'm 20 in 1960, I'm running the country at this point, right? That the people who grew up in this era become the ones who make the policies that basically form the EU. Is that too much of a stretch? Or do you think that some of the foundational components of that idea of a borderless continent come out of this?
The latter, definitely. So the concept of a borderless continent definitely come out of young people and their travel. They are the vanguard that sort of pushes for this. They're demanding this, even in the 1950s. I'll pull up, here's another image. So in the 1950s, this is 51 or 52. You know, in French it says the youth want Europe, and it also says it in German and elsewhere. This is on the French-Italian border at Menton. So basically, you have in the early 1950s, you have a movement of young people called the European Youth Campaign, who are advocating and protesting at borders. They do it all throughout Western Europe, demanding opening borders. And then they start advocating the reason how you end up with rail passes, which we should probably talk about, Interrail and Eurail, is because of the young people begin demanding it as a market. And so that integrates rail passage and travel mobility on rail systems in the 60s and the 1970s. So absolutely, but so what I'm arguing in the book about EU, while I sort of say, look, European integration and the European Union are not the exact same thing. European integration's a much bigger umbrella, and European Union is under that umbrella and a big part of it. But one of the things I'm trying to talk about in this book is the ways in which the circulation of young people in ever widening matrices, more and more young people from more and more places, visiting more and more places, that creates a travel culture. What we think of as backpacking in Europe is not natural, it's new, it develops. And so as that develops, that way of traveling, and importantly, that way of traveling is not that you go on a package tour and you sit at a holiday resort. The point is to travel and to constantly be on the move, and to constantly be on the move with other young people who you've met along the way. That's a new thing. That's a new way of traveling and experiencing the world. And when you do that, you establish a community, right? Even if it's short-lived with a particular person, right? You identify and you think of yourself as participating in this thing that is transnational all across Europe, and eventually it spills out of Europe, right?
Well, and that's so one of the next things I want to talk about is it does eventually spill to the United States. I mean, you know, up until the mid-1950s, it's costly to get to Europe. You're on a boat. Yep. You know, so it takes a long time, and early flights are expensive. And then you start to get into charter flights, which then also ties to the idea of your rail passes. And for all of the people on here who are younger I am and don't remember this. The way a charter flight would work is that you would basically scan the back of newspapers, and some packager would be saying flight to Rome, $110.
Yep.
But the thing is that until they sold enough seats, they didn't have a date. And so you would pay your $110, and then they would tell you within a couple days of travel, your flight's leaving on Thursday. And you just had to get there. So the fluidity that was needed to travel through this was huge, but the cost was 1/10 of what it would have been if you were trying to use a booked flight.
That's right.
And, many of my friends did this, where they would just, all of a sudden be like, yeah, I can't make your party this weekend. I'm going to Rome, or I'm going to Paris. And it became sort of the migration path for, young adults who just were sort of carefree, that sort of reinforced that whole notion of the vagabond life. And then you'd buy your rail pass, and the rule was that you had to travel in 3 countries. You couldn't travel, were only limited to like 7 stops. I mean, there were various restrictions on it that sort of forced you to keep moving.
Right. That was so a couple of things on that. So by the 1970s, you have 1 million young Americans a year traveling to Europe. Now, Americans often think that they invented that sort of backpacking thing. It was Europeans first, because of course they had they didn't have to, they were already there.
They didn't have to get on a plane.
It's pretty easy. One thing that Americans did is because Americans, once they could get across the Atlantic cheaply, and in addition to the charter, to respond to the charter flights, the big airlines started offering last minute student fares. They had empty seats on the plane. They would just say, all right, here's a student fare for $200 or $150, Pan Am, TWA, whatever. They don't even exist anymore, those airlines. So by the late 1960s, Americans can get over there, and American youth are using their Eurail Pass, which was originally for wealthy adults. But young people realize this is a deal, because, hey, I'll just sleep on the train. Who needs to book a hotel? So they offer then in 71 the Eurail Youth Pass.
Mm-hmm.
And that's only for non-European youth. So then is offered the Interrail Pass in 1972, which is for young people in Europe. Right. And so now you have a rail pass that for $100, $150, you can travel just about on any train at any time for a month to 2 months anywhere in Western Europe.
Mm-hmm. And it's true. I totally forgotten about that the way we would use them is that you basically would be like 2 days in Paris, and then I'm going to Zagreb, and I'm sleeping on the train, so I don't have to worry about the hotel that night.
Right. I knew somebody in the 80s, somebody who was really interested in Germany, and so would explore a northern German city, during the day, take the night train to southern Germany to a different city, and then take the night train back up, overnight to northern Germany, to a different northern, and just went back and forth, spending the night on the train between northern and southern Germany for, a couple of weeks, never paying for lodging.
Yeah. And, and then the other system that really did build up, and particularly my experience was it was the strongest in Italy. And that was, you would pull into the train station, there literally be little old ladies standing there with a sign that says $10 bed. Mm-hmm. And you would go home with them. And the deal was you could not see the apartment before you went there. You had to pay them the $10 up front. And I did this in Florence. And, I was like, I just don't know. It feels a little weird. And we get upstairs, and literally it's cathedral size stained glass windows in the apartment that they had. And it overlooked the piazza. It was beautiful for $10. And they usually you got breakfast or something like that. They didn't usually feed you more than one meal, but you were part of the family. You sat at the family table with them. You were in their house. And I did that for years. And, when it became a little more structured, like in Scotland, you would go into the tourism office and they would book you the next room. Yep.
I backpacked in the summer 1990. I was 21. So the 1989, the Berlin Wall, all that had happened less than a year prior. Mm-hmm. So we were able to travel into the East. So we went to, we went to Budapest, and we went to Prague, and we went to East Berlin, and in those cities, they hadn't had decades of backpackers passing through, and so they didn't have the infrastructure. And so exactly that, people at the train stations just took us home. You paid them a little bit of money and you just stayed there for 2 or 3 days. But it meant in those places at that time, because there wasn't all the infrastructure there to serve, capitalism, to serve, that clientele, it was hard. It was like the daily grind of finding something to eat, figuring out the public transportation, all that stuff was much more difficult than it was in Western Europe, but also, fascinating because.
Right, and again, I think that was one of the things that it sort of launches this adventurism travel, right? The idea that this is how Lonely Planet develops as a travel guide,
and
right? Which is, I'm not following a photo's guide. I'm not doing the 10 sites to see in Paris.
Yeah.
And it wasn't structured. I can't count the number of countries I was in where there was not an English language menu anywhere and no one spoke a word of English. And so I would always learn, a couple hundred words of whatever the language was, so I could negotiate for a room and at least mildly figure out what they were serving me as food. We bicycled through most of Europe, and the two stories that sort of resonated with me from my experience that you were talking about. So as we were biking through Italy, literally we would go into every little town and people would be like, "What are you doing? Why are you on a bike? Where are you going? We have buses."
Yeah.
And they were offended by the fact that we were traveling through their country. And then in Yugoslavia, we would just sort of ditch the bikes on the side of the road with our panniers on them and then go hike some ruin that wasn't even on a map. And every time we would come back, some old man would be sitting there and he'd yell at us, "Somebody's going to steal from you.
Don't leave this here."
Yeah. And I thought to myself, no one will ever steal from me because there is always an old man sitting watching my bike when I come back, because they all watched out for us. And so was it really, I don't know that sort of travel exists still, but one of the things, and again, tying back to your book, once Asia starts to build out of the war, right? Once we come out of the Vietnam War and once China opens up, that becomes the next adventure land, right? That becomes the next place that young adults want to go because they're looking for something that's off the beaten path.
Right. So you have a so-called hippie trail, which is basically an overland route between Europe and India, Nepal, through Istanbul, often starting in Ibiza, which is this island in Spain. So the hippie trail, and I have a good picture of it. They basically, these independent tour operators would basically run buses, right? And you would ride these buses, for a few days.
I've been on those.
And hop on and off, across Turkey and Iran and Afghanistan and on into India. But then in 1979, Iran has a revolution. And then in 1980, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. And so that whole thing falls apart. And then the travel becomes Thailand, Bali, more the beaches in Southeast Asia, Vietnam. That's so in the 1980s and 90s. That's when we see that sort of emerge. So so backpacking now is no longer centered, on Europe, and less and less even associated with Europe. It's trekking, somewhere, or it's in, Costa Rica or, Central America. Yeah.
So I realize that we have used up almost all of the time, but this is a good transition. So one of the things that becomes interesting as we look at sort of where travel goes from there, right? So you're looking at the 2000s, is you start to get event-based tourism, right? The Brandenburg Gates concert, Montreux, some of them are constructed very casually, some of them are quite intentional. And then the other thing that you start to get is global citizen travel, where it is really looking at how do I help, right? It goes back to sort of the foundational story of the rebuilding of Europe, which is what can I do while I'm there? I'm not just here to see, I'm here to be part of this community.
Mm-hmm. My favorite, so the so-called voluntourism of the last few decades. My favorite story, you know, when you start researching something, a big history book, like you sort of have an inkling that you're going to find things, but you don't know about everything you're going to find to research. So one of my favorite things is the story of the Mud Angels, which is in 1966 in Florence experiences a terrible flood, and it deposits many, you know, several meters deep of mud in all the museums and all the artworks of Florence. And what happens is young people who are already around traveling immediately go to Florence to help. I have a great Mud Angels picture here somewhere. Oh, there it is. And they come from all over Europe. They just like, you know, all right, I'll just take my ticket and I'll go to Florence and I'll help for a few weeks. Here we have some Mud Angels resting. And so the people of Florence were just like flabbergasted at this. They were there before the government got there, right? And so the young people were there sort of volunteering and helping, you know, take valuable paintings, you know, Botticelli paintings out of the Uffizi galleries, and clean up the city. So that has been a component of this, you know, all along too, even when it's unplanned, right? This impromptu moment in which the young people just sort of come there.
Rally and help.
There weren't that many. There were only a few thousand, probably. Like there's no hard data of how many did that. For some would stay for a month, but in Florence they are legendary for this moment, and very, very, you know, aptly celebrated for that. But travel now is super different because so this sort of backpacking travel was long haul, right? You would do it and you would do it for a month or two. Now, you know, with discount airlines, you can pop to some place for, you know, 2 or 3, you know, and with high-speed trains, it's easy to just sort of zip over for a quick trip somewhere. Mm-hmm. And so you see much less long haul sort of stuff. And of course, you're not isolated. Like my parents had no idea where I was.
I know.
For months. They couldn't reach me. They didn't know where I was. And now everybody's in contact with everybody all the time. Yeah. And so you're not, that sense of being, you know, isolated and alone is gone.
And immersed.
Yeah.
Right. The immersion.
Right. You're tethered. You're tethered and connected. It's easy to get money because you just go to an ATM, you know, so currency's easy. You're in touch with whatever's happening back at home or with whoever, and you can meet up with people. Like the challenge of, it's like somebody who you're sort of traveling with, and then you're sort of like, you go in separate ways and you sort of say, okay, I'll meet you at this train station in Munich, you know, on July 14th. Yeah. You know, maybe they would show up there, maybe they wouldn't, right? But now you can coordinate, you can plan, you can book stuff ahead of time, book your train tickets, whatever. So all of those sorts of, you know, means have really changed the experience, you know, of travel.
Well, and I think that, you know, it's funny because in some ways, although it's more accessible, it's also diminished. You know, I always thought of sort of the way people move through that, particularly that period in the 70s and 80s, like a bird murmuration, right? Which is there'd be some of us get together and then some of us would break off and go to Germany, others were going to somewhere else. And then you might or might not run into each other, but it would be random. Like all of a sudden you walk into the youth hostel in Edinburgh and there are 3 people that you were in Yugoslavia with.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I ran into people, you know, I had met earlier in the summer somewhere else later on.
Yeah. And so it was that happenstance sort of relationship where you felt like you were all part of something.
Well, and I do think that similar spaces, right? Because you're part of this community. So when you got on the train, so the trains now have seating like an airplane, right? Yeah. But the trains then, you know, were compartments of
the 6 in a car with a door,
seats, you know, 3 seats facing each other. And so you get on the train and you would walk down until you found a car that had other backpackers in it, and that would be the car that you would go into, right? You would seek it out, and then you'd meet people.
All right, so we are almost at 10:02. So are there any questions from the audience? Any of you want to share experiences? because otherwise I can keep talking, as everybody who knows me knows.
I'd love to ask a question, Rick, if you have a moment to
Yeah.
indulge in me. Just reading through your book and listening through your presentation today, and thinking about all these amazing topics that you were discussing, the picture that I was painting in my head about all of this, where specifically in the context of something like the Second World War during the 40s, and how youth travel started to grow back after that period, that really treacherous period. It seems like something that when people are starved of something as quintessential to their lives as travel, when they're starved of it and they aren't allowed to because of any sort of innumerable amount of variables that have to do with how life is going on, or what is allowed, what's not allowed, what's safe and what's dangerous. I think it's fascinating how these youth travelers kind of became a bloodstream of sort to kind of help mend back together Europe after that period of just tragedy and horrible things happening, and people not being able to have those experiences with one another. And so I want to ask you, when you were researching this book, maybe in the context of what has been happening in the past 2 years, did you at all get closer to what you thought was the intrinsic human quality for why people travel? Was that something that you thought about, just looking at all these stories of people coming together, possibly as a sense of communion or as a sense of self-realization? Did that come into your mind at all, thinking about, what is it, that human, that instinct, whatever it is, that drive, did that cross your mind at all when you were doing your research?
Well, for me, it's food and beer.
That's always mine.
But I think particularly for young people, right? So one of the key things for young people is they are eager to get away from home and from parents, and they are not yet fully integrated into systems. They maybe don't yet have a mortgage. They maybe, are not married or have a job that they're going to lose. So for young people in particular, I think there's a very conscious sort of choice that's sort of like, now is the time. If I'm going to do this sort of thing, then now is the time to do it. And then the thing about travel is, and this is very well demonstrated, the people who travel are the people who've already traveled. And so once people travel, they want to do more and more and more of it. And so when you start traveling as a young person, people continue traveling, for the rest of their lives, typically. So it's not that often that you have new tourists or new travelers, because it's other people sort of trying to, sustain that. And in your question, I know hints at this, and we're going to see it. Assuming it's a big assumption, assuming we are coming out of the pandemic. If that turns out to be the case, wow, look out. And those plane tickets are going to be expensive because people are going to,
they're in high demand.
They're desperate. And not just to travel, it's, seeing people haven't seen their family and close friends and all that sort of stuff. There's going to be a real pent up desire and demand for that sort of thing. And I think we'll see a lot of it.
And this is just a random connection to this, but on Facebook today, there was a whole sort of chat room thing going on around how to help the people of Ukraine. And one of the things somebody suggested was just booking Airbnbs in Ukraine and telling them you're not coming, but you're paying them. It was a way to get direct revenue to people. And then other people were like, Etsy, you can buy things off of Etsy and tell them they don't have to ship them. Mm-hmm. And there is something that felt very in keeping with what this book had been about, this idea that I can help people from another country because I can, and because it's something I should do. And I'm doing it through the mechanisms of travel, even when I can't travel there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Of course, is Airbnb going to still take their cut?
Well, so what Airbnb said is, while they will be taking a cut, the thing that they're doing is they're offering free stays across all of Europe to Ukrainians who make it out of the country. So if you're a Ukrainian citizen, you don't have to pay for your lodging. And so they're using that revenue to fund that program and be able to pay to be able to support the people who are offering their houses up, which is really interesting. And so again, it's this idea of this sort of informal but immediate network of support that is created around 1 million refugees who, you know, just built up in the last week as a massive refugee population.
Yeah.
So when you're teaching this in class, what are the things that resonate the most with your students today? Like, what does an 18-year-old pull out of this?
Well, whenever I teach the history of young people and youth, the first thing is that there is such a thing, like that just like anything else, one can study the history of young people and see that there is a history there. And so when you know, if we study 1968, right, students are always, I mean, this is, you know, I sort of originally as an undergraduate learned about 1968 and was just like, wow, this is, you know, like young people are advocating for political change based on what their autonomy as being young. Right, they're basing their political identity and their autonomy on themselves as a social group and as a social cohort, and it's just, you know, that sort of blows me away. And so young people very often, you know, they'll read this stuff or learn about this and see it as empowering, right? As like, oh my God, like this stuff has happened. But it's so often, you know, when you teach history in college, whatever you're teaching, typically students are just like, I had no idea, you know, why haven't I been taught this before? Like, they often feel, and this speaks to sort of legislation that's taking place in many states right now, they often feel like, not that they've been lied to, but kind of like, why haven't I been taught this?
Yeah, there's an intentional omission.
Yeah, and they're just like, I didn't know that this is, you know, what was going on, or that this is what history is. I thought history was just, you know, a bunch of dates and facts and stuff, not that it was a way of thinking, you know. And so that's the most fun thing in teaching any sort of historical topic is getting students to understand that history is a way of seeing the world and understanding the world. It's a process of thinking. Yeah.
And I think the potency of groups as opposed to the grand and glorious leader, right? That's one of the things, particularly about youth movements, is.
Oh yeah. So I'm a social historian. I like studying. I'm not particularly interested. I mean, I teach it, of course, because you have to, but I'm not particularly interested in the rich and powerful and the great men. I want to know what were people doing? What were the people doing? You know, what were they interested in? What books were they reading? What movies were they going to? What were they eating? You know, I find that really interesting to me. Yeah.
George, do we have any other questions?
Nothing has popped up in the chat just yet.
Okay. Well, I think that we are at 7:58. And so I want to thank you, Rick. This was a really enjoyable conversation. Happily, we do get a lot of traffic on our YouTube page. This will be posted there. And so, you know, I hope that this moves beyond, you know, tonight's audience and a much larger audience, because it's a fascinating topic. And you did a brilliant job sort of presenting it in a way where literally, and for somebody who traveled as much as I did, I literally every chapter I'd be like, I didn't know that. That's amazing. I didn't know about that person. That's incredible.
So that's the other thing, right? It's like, is one other thing I wanted to do in the book is I was hoping people would see, young people now and yourself, young people before, that you start to recognize yourself as a historical actor, even if you don't know it. Even if you don't know that you're doing something that is historical and is going to have an impact in the aggregate, you are. And so that's the other thing that students often take away from this, is they start to think about what they're doing and how what they're doing is itself a part of history. Yeah.
Well, and the other thing, you know, and this is one of the things that we're always trying to capture at the History Center, which is the quotidian experience evaporates. It's not covered by newspapers. It's not really something that's written about. And so things like the charter plane, I hadn't thought about a charter flight in 30 years. And so to have it documented and to pull me back and make me think about how much it framed what that daily life experience was like and the way my friends traveled, like that, it's so nice to see it brought forward again and made a historical record so that it is there for other people to understand. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. For sale now somewhere.
That's right.
Look. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you. All right.
Wonderful. Yeah, so I can just say a few words just before we go. I can't express enough sympathies as well. Rick, thank you so much for taking the time to do this, for sharing all this incredible information from your book. That's Backpack Ambassadors, How Youth Travel Integrated Europe, available on a wide variety of online book retailers. So I want to say a couple words. Carol, Professor Jobs, thank you again. Taking a look ahead at what we have planned for the History Center, this Saturday, we have our third and first in-person iteration of Little Historians in partnership with the Lake Forest Library, just down the street in Lake Forest. This theme for the Saturday we'll be focusing all entirely on space travel, astronomy, and the Apollo program, specifically on our very own Jim Lovell. So if you know any aspiring young historians ages 5 to 9 who are interested in that sort of thing, registration is open on our main website. On March 24th, we are very excited to announce curator and historian from the Best-Bauer Dunn Museum in Libertyville, Diana Dretsky, will be speaking on her new book, The Bonds of War, talking about Lake County soldiers and their connection to the American Civil War, with some really fascinating information on soldiers originating from the Lake Forest, Lake Bluff area. And then a few weeks later, on April 7th, we have History of Women's Health and the Women's Board in collaboration with Northwestern Medicine Lake Forest Hospital. We'll be having a panel discussion with 2 representatives from the Women's Board, Maddie Dugan and Debbie Saran, as well as 2 licensed doctors from Northwestern Medicine Lake Forest Hospital to talk about the evolution of women's health and also how the Women's Board over the past 75 years have been able to impact the lives of not only medicine and wellness, but also of Lake Forest in general. So if you want more information about any of those programs or anything else coming up at the History Center, you can head on over to our main website, which is lflbhistory.org. So once again, I want to say thank you to everybody for attending tonight's program. It was recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, History Center of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, within the next couple days. So once again, thank you to everybody for attending, and we wish you a good night from us at the History Center.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, George.